Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. On a deserted road in the state of Nevada, where the city lights disappeared into the horizon, there was a 7-Eleven store that was open 24 hours a day. Isolated between desert and darkness, the store was a rare stopping point for travelers and truck drivers. Ethan, a 22-year-old university student, had started working the early morning shift to earn some extra money during the holidays. The store, with its fluorescent lights and organized aisles, seemed harmless, but there was something strange about the place. Ethan's colleagues often told stories about unexplainable events, mysterious sounds, objects that moved around, and most frighteningly, customers who appeared and disappeared without a trace. Ethan never cared about stories. To him, they were just attempts to scare a newcomer. However, that night, something would change forever. It was midnight, and Ethan was alone at the counter. The store's aisles were empty, and the only company were the security cameras, which he checked every now and then. The silence was broken only by the sound of the refrigerator cooling the drinks and the wind blowing outside. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Ethan looked toward the door when the bell rang, but he didn't see anyone coming in. He came out from behind the counter and went to the entrance, thinking that perhaps it was a gust of wind that had opened the door. The parking lot was empty, except for a rusty pickup truck that was already there when he started his shift. As soon as he closed the door and returned to the counter, he noticed something strange. One of the hallways was in disarray. Soda cans were scattered across the floor, forming a pattern that seemed deliberate. Ethan looked at the security cameras, but the video showed no one in the hallway. Trying to ignore the feeling of discomfort, he organized the cans again and returned to the counter. But as he looked at the cameras once again, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. On the monitor, a tall, hooded figure stood in the back hallway, motionless. Ethan looked away from the cameras and looked directly into the back hallway. There was no one there. He looked back at the monitor, but the figure was gone. He tried to convince himself it was just a problem with the camera system or early morning fatigue. But while adjusting the screen, a new notification appeared. Motion detected, warehouse. The warehouse was at the back of the store, connected by a narrow door. Ethan didn't want to go there, but he knew he needed to check. Taking a flashlight, he opened the warehouse door. The space was dark and cold, with rows of shelves filled with boxes of products. Deep inside, he heard a sound. It was low, almost imperceptible, like a whisper. He pointed his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing. Then something fell. A can of energy drink rolled off a shelf, stopping at his feet. Ethan picked up the can and looked around, feeling the oppressive silence of the warehouse. When he turned to go back to the store, he found the door closed. He tried to open it, but it seemed locked from the inside. The electrical panel which controlled the locks was flashing red lights as if it were malfunctioning. Suddenly, all the lights in the warehouse went out. Ethan was left in total darkness except for the dim light of his flashlight. He heard slow, shuffling footsteps approaching from behind. He quickly spun around, but there was no one there, just silence and motionless shelves. He began to hear heavy breathing very close by, but as he turned again, the flashlight went out. Somehow, the warehouse door opened on its own. Ethan ran back into the store, locking the door behind him. He looked at the cameras again and saw that the lights in the warehouse had come back on, but everything seemed calm. He began to breathe heavily, trying to convince himself that it was due to lack of sleep. But when he looked down the back aisle of the store, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. The hooded figure was there again, looking directly into one of the cameras. This time, she moved. Slowly, the figure turned and began walking towards the counter. Ethan came out from behind the counter, but when he looked down the hall, it was still empty. He heard the sound of the doorbell again and rushed to the entrance. But instead of leaving, the figure was standing outside, looking at him through the glass. The figure outside had no face. Where there should have been eyes, nose, and mouth, there was only a smooth, pale surface. Ethan tried to open the door to confront her, but she wouldn't budge, as if she was sealed. When he turned to look again, the figure had disappeared. However, something had changed inside the store. The lights were flickering and all the refrigerators had stopped working. The temperature began to drop, and a loud metallic sound echoed throughout the room, coming from all directions. Ethan ran to get his cell phone, but he had no signal. He looked at the cameras once more and saw that each hallway was now filled with identical figures, all motionless, looking directly at the cameras. On the counter, the landline phone started ringing. Ethan answered hesitantly, and a deep, distorted voice spoke. "You opened the door. Now it cannot be closed." Before he could respond, the phone went dead. When he looked at the cameras again, all the figures had disappeared, but the lights were still flashing. One last notification appeared on the camera screen. Motion detected. Parking. Ethan looked out the window and saw something that made him shiver. In the parking lot there was a line of hooded figures, all looking directly at the store. Ethan froze, staring at the parking lot. The line of hooded figures was endless, each one perfectly still, their silhouettes highlighted by the store's light. Even though they didn't have faces, he felt the weight of their gazes, as if they were capable of seeing his every thought. The wind outside grew stronger, making the glass doors vibrate. Ethan backed away, trying to find a safe place, but the inside of the store now seemed even more oppressive. The lights flickered violently, casting shadows that moved on their own through the hallways. Suddenly, the doorbell rang again, and Ethan instinctively turned around. The automatic doors slowly slid open, despite there being no one around. The icy wind came in, bringing with it a metallic smell, almost like blood. A long shadow cast itself across the ground, growing until it reached Ethan's feet. He retreated behind the counter, trying to call the police on the landline. However, when he picked up the device, he noticed that the cable had been cut. When he looked at the camera screen, what he saw made his stomach drop. The hooded figures were now inside the store. Each hallway had one of them, still and motionless, but much closer than before. A wall clock, which Ethan had never noticed before, began to make a loud, rhythmic noise, like a metallic tick-tock. He looked up and saw that the hands were moving backwards, marking a countdown. 0:10, no. Below the clock, the words "choose or be chosen" began to flash red. Ethan tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched became unbearable. He felt something was approaching, but he couldn't see it directly. The figures in the hallways began to move, their footsteps echoing like scratches on the tiled floor. Ethan tried to escape to the back, but the warehouse door was locked again. He grabbed a wrench from under the counter, the only object he could use as a weapon. Suddenly, one of the figures appeared in front of him. She was tall, thin, and her lack of facial features was even more disturbing up close. She didn't move, but the temperature around her dropped drastically. Ethan tried to attack her with the wrench, but before he could get closer, the figure disappeared in a cloud of shadows. Behind him, the doorbell rang again. Ethan looked out the window and saw something impossible. The once empty parking lot now seemed to go on for miles, with endless rows of cars he didn't recognize. In each vehicle, there was a seated figure, all looking directly at the store. The distorted voice he had heard on the phone came back, echoing throughout the store. The door was opened. "You are part of the cycle now. The timer on the clock has reached 0:00, and all the lights in the store went out." Ethan was left in complete darkness, hearing only his rapid breathing and the footsteps of the figures around him. Suddenly, a single light came back on, illuminating the counter. On it, there was a note that wasn't there before. "You can escape, but someone must take your place." Next to the note was a small knife and a list of names, including his own. Ethan recognized some of the names. They were old colleagues who had worked at that store and mysteriously disappeared. Ethan knew the only way to escape was to add another name to the list. But who? He had no one in mind, and time seemed to be running out. The hooded figures began to surround him, getting closer and closer, their footsteps echoing in sync. The voice returned, this time whispering directly into his mind. "Make your choice or accept emptiness." Ethan took the knife. but hesitated. He couldn't force himself to complete the cycle, even though he knew his refusal would doom him. When Ethan dropped the knife, the figures advanced. He felt an overwhelming cold, and in an instant, his vision went black. When he opened his eyes again, he was in the parking lot, sitting inside one of the cars. From the outside, the store looked normal, bright and quiet. However, at the counter, a new employee had started his shift. The cycle had begun again, and now Ethan was part of the endless ranks, watching from afar, waiting for the next chosen one. Before we continue, if you liked my content, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments at what time do you dare to listen to these macabre stories. Now, without further interruptions, let's move on to the next story. In the heart of the city of Dallas, Texas, a 7-Eleven store sat on a busy corner, surrounded by old office buildings and apartments. Despite being located in a relatively safe neighborhood, the store had a peculiar reputation. Reports of strange activity during the early hours were frequent among employees, and local residents avoided going in after 11 p.m. Samantha, a 24-year-old who had just gotten the job, didn't believe the rumors. For her, it was just a store like any other. Working the night shift was a way to earn extra money and have some peace to study. That night, Samantha was alone. The manager had left early, and the other employee had cancelled his shift. With only the cold light of the hallways and the constant hum of the refrigerators for company, she began organizing the shelves while listening to music on her headphones. At around 2 a.m., the doorbell rang. Samantha looked toward the door when the bell rang, but didn't see anyone coming in. Finding the event strange, she approached the entrance, hoping to find a customer, but the parking lot was empty. The streets, normally quiet at that hour, were completely deserted. She checked the security cameras and saw something intriguing. The video showed the bell being activated, but the door hadn't moved. No wind or physical interference was visible, just the sound, echoing through the silence of the store. Thinking it was just a glitch in the system, Samantha returned to the counter. But as she passed through one of the corridors, she felt an inexplicable chill, as if she were being watched. While checking the liquor stock, Samantha heard a noise coming from the back of the store. It sounded like the sound of something dragging on the floor, accompanied by a slight metallic creak. Reluctantly, she went to the warehouse door and slowly opened it. The warehouse was dark and cold, as if the refrigeration system had been drastically increased. In the center of the space, a shelf was fallen, with boxes scattered across the floor. She bent down to pick up the items, but something caught her attention. Long, scratchy marks on the floor, as if something had been pulled violently. The warehouse lights began to flicker. Samantha heard a low sound, similar to a whisper, coming from a dark corner. She tried to illuminate the area with her cell phone's flashlight, but found nothing but deep shadows. Feeling uncomfortable, Samantha returned to the main area of the store and tried to close the warehouse door. However, the door seemed stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it open. She gave up and went back to the counter, trying to focus on her work. But as he looked at the cameras again, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. There was a figure standing in the refrigerator aisle. She was tall and still, her face covered in shadows. Samantha looked directly into the hallway, but saw nothing. When he looked back at the cameras, the figure had moved. It was now closer to the counter. The doorbell rang once again. This time the door opened, but no one entered. The cold wind invaded the store, briefly turning off some of the lights. Samantha rushed to close it, but noticed something strange in the parking lot. Footprints, large and deep, heading toward the entrance, but there was no sign of who had left them. As he locked the door, he heard the sound of cans falling in one of the hallways. When he went to check, he found a message written in dust on the floor. "You shouldn't be here." Back at the counter, Samantha tried to call the police, but the phone was dead. His cell phone also had no signal. When he looked at the cameras, he noticed that the images were distorted, with interference and noise. On one of the screens, the hooded figure reappeared, standing at the entrance of the store, looking directly at the camera. When Samantha looked at the entrance, there was no one there. The screens began to show images that didn't make sense. Empty corridors, but with shadows that moved alone. The image of the warehouse, where boxes seemed to float slightly before falling again. And most disturbingly, a camera showed Samantha from behind, sitting at the counter, but she knew there was no camera positioned there. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. Silence took over the store, interrupted only by the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps. Samantha took a flashlight and tried to illuminate the room, but the beam of light was swallowed by the darkness. She felt something pass by her, a cold, heavy breeze that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. When he shined his flashlight into the nearest hallway, he saw the hooded figure for the first time, motionless, with long, misshapen arms dragging themselves across the floor. She blinked, and the figure disappeared. But a new message appeared on the glass of the door, written in what appeared to be blood. "There is no way out." Samantha ran to the front door and tried to open it, but it seemed locked from the inside. Each attempt caused the bell to ring, echoing through the empty store. The lights suddenly came back on, revealing something terrifying. All the shelves were covered in handprints, as if dozens of people had passed by. The cameras began to show figures appearing from all sides, filling the hallways. They didn't move, but they seemed to be looking directly at Samantha. Suddenly, the security system's main screen flashed, showing a single message: "Take it or be taken." Samantha stared at the message on the monitor screen. Take it or be taken. The figures that had previously been motionless in the corridors began to move. His steps were slow, but each one seemed to resonate like thunder in the store. The shadows stretched and seemed to take on a life of their own, slowly swallowing the illuminated corners. She retreated to the counter, holding a small stick she had found, the only object she could use to defend herself. But deep down, he knew that what he was fighting against was not something that could be defeated by physical means. The monitor flashed again, this time showing a countdown. 0-10. Zo. The count started to go down quickly. Meanwhile, the figures continued to approach, each more distorted than the last. Their silhouettes seemed to melt, and their arms dragged across the floor, leaving dark trails that seemed to burn the floor. Suddenly, the lights flickered frantically, revealing something new. The store had changed. The corridors were now longer, impossible to walk through in just a few steps. Each shelf seemed to multiply, forming a maze that extended far beyond the physical space of the store. In the central hall, a larger figure appeared. It was different from the others, taller, more solid, and its presence made the air around it tremble. A deep voice echoed through the store, coming from all directions. She wasn't human. It was a sound that seemed to pierce through Samantha's mind, filling every corner of her consciousness. The cycle needs balance. You open the door. Now you must choose. The monitor screen flashed again, displaying two buttons: accept the cycle and refuse. Below the buttons, a new message appeared. Refusing means losing everything. Accepting keeps the store alive. Samantha felt a wave of despair. She didn't know what it meant to accept the cycle, but refusing it felt like a death sentence. As he thought, the figures continued to approach, blocking all exits. The count on the monitor reached Wo5 Zadru. Suddenly the doorbell rang again. She looked towards the entrance and saw a larger shadow, which seemed to be waiting outside. The figure was tall and had no defined features, but its presence was oppressive. One last message appeared on the monitor: choose now or be overwhelmed by the abyss. Samantha, unable to accept the fate imposed by the figure, decided to run through the corridors in search of a way out. However, each corridor seemed to expand as she went. The store had turned into an endless maze, with shifting shelves blocking his path. She heard the sound of figures behind her, moving faster now. The shelves began to creak, as if they were part of something alive. At the end of one of the hallways, she saw a door. It was different from the others. An old wooden door. with strange symbols carved into its surface. She ran to the door, feeling the figures approaching. As soon as she opened it, she was sucked in by an invisible force. Samantha found herself in an empty, infinite space, with the ground covered in thick fog. In the center of the void, there was a pedestal with an open book. As she got closer, she saw that the book had an endless list of names, including hers. The voice returned, echoing around him. Choose a name to replace yours. Thus, the cycle will continue, and you will be freed. Samantha noticed that each name on the list was someone who had worked at or visited the store. She also understood that the cycle required a victim, and her only way out was to sacrifice someone else. The countdown has reached 0101. With tears streaming down her face, Samantha looked at the book, trying to find a name she didn't recognize. When the timer reached 0230, she chose a random name. The moment he did so, he felt a wave of relief, but also guilt. The emptiness around her began to disappear, and she woke up lying on the floor of the store. Everything seemed normal again. The lights were stable, and the hallways returned to their original size. However, something was different. Samantha looked at the cameras and saw that the figures had disappeared. But when he looked at the monitor, his name was no longer on the list. Instead, the name she had chosen was marked with a red light. The doorbell rang once again, and a new employee entered the store to begin his shift. He looked at Samantha and asked if everything was okay. She tried to respond, but her voice wouldn't come out. As he worked, Samantha realized that she was now part of the store. She was one of the hooded figures, doomed to watch as the cycle repeated itself. Before we continue, if you like my content, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments at what time do you dare to listen to these macabre stories. Now, without further interruptions, let's move on to the next story. On a rural Pennsylvania road sat an isolated 7-Eleven store, surrounded only by dense forests and dark roads. For many locals, the store was the only stop for miles, offering basic supplies for late-night travelers. Michael, a 25-year-old young man, was covering a colleague's night shift. It was his first early shift, and he was confident it would just be a dull night with few customers. The store was small, quiet, and the only lighting came from fluorescent lights that flickered every now and then. Around midnight, while organizing the snacks, the doorbell rang. Michael looked at the entrance but saw no one. Michael felt a chill when he realized that the doorbell had rung with no one visible. He went to the entrance, looked at the empty parking lot, and closed the door, assuming it was a mechanical problem. But something seemed wrong. The air was heavier, and the silence that had once been comforting now seemed ominous. Returning to the counter, he looked at the security cameras. In one of them, which pointed towards the drinks aisle, he saw a shadow pass quickly. Michael froze. He looked straight down the hall, but saw nothing. As I thought about reviewing the images, the sound of something falling echoed through the store. He ran to the beverage aisle and found several broken soda bottles on the floor. However, there were no signs that anyone was there. Back at the counter, Michael looked at the cameras again and saw something that made him freeze. A figure stood at the back of the store, motionless, as if looking directly into the camera. She was tall and thin, with disproportionately long arms and a hunched posture. He looked at the corresponding location in the store, but there was nothing there. When he looked back at the monitor, the figure had disappeared. Suddenly, all the lights in the store flashed violently, and the doorbell rang again. This time, the sound was followed by light footsteps on the floor. Michael called out loudly, asking if anyone was there. There was no response. He took out his cell phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The landline was also dead. Walking slowly through the halls, Michael felt as if he was being watched. When he reached the back of the store, he heard a low sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the warehouse. He hesitated before opening the door. Inside the warehouse, everything was silent. But there was something strange. On the floor, long, scratchy marks seemed to form a path that led to the industrial freezer. Michael opened the freezer, hoping to find a logical explanation. Instead, he found something that didn't make sense. The inside was completely empty, except for a single box in the center. As he approached, he noticed that the box was covered in dust, as if it had been there for decades. He opened it carefully and found an aged piece of paper with a message written on it. "They come when you are alone. Don't look at them directly." Michael stepped back, feeling a shiver run down his spine. As soon as he closed the freezer, he heard a metallic sound behind him. As he turned around, he saw a figure in the corner of the warehouse, partially covered by shadows. The figure remained motionless, but the warehouse seemed colder and darker. Michael tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out. When he blinked, the figure was closer, as if it had moved without making a sound. He ran to the warehouse door and locked it from the inside. On the other side, he heard loud, regular knocks, as if something was trying to enter. Back in the main area of the store, Michael saw that the shelves had moved, creating a narrow, oppressive maze. He tried to find his way back to the counter, but each hallway seemed to take him further away. As he tried to get his bearings, he saw something in the refrigerator window. It was his own reflection, but he wasn't moving like he should. In the reflection, he was standing still, with completely black eyes and an empty smile. Michael felt a lump in his throat. When he turned around, there was nothing behind him, but the reflection continued to stare at him, now slowly waving its hand. He ran toward the store entrance, trying to open the automatic door, but it didn't respond. The bell rang again, but the door was still closed. Suddenly, a new message appeared on the security camera monitor. "You opened the door for them. Now, you must decide." Michael didn't understand what this meant, but he knew something was demanding a choice from him. The figures began to appear on the cameras again, this time closer, surrounding each corridor. He heard the sound of something being dragged across the floor, and as he looked, he saw dark marks appearing wherever he walked, as if something invisible was leaving a trail. The figures Michael saw on the cameras were now all over the store, each one closer and defining an invisible siege. He moved quickly between the aisles, but it was as if the store was alive, rearranging its shelves to block him or lead him somewhere specific. The monitors flashed messages. "You must decide. Open the way or close it forever." Michael didn't understand the meaning, but he knew he was being tested. He felt that every step he took him deeper into something much bigger than he could imagine. He tried to stay away from the figures, but now they weren't just on camera. As he turned a hallway, he saw one of them standing motionless, with her arms hanging as if they were too heavy to lift. Even without a face, he knew he was being watched. When he tried to run through another hallway, he saw another figure. This time, she was bent over a shelf, as if she were examining the products, but she was moving slowly, almost imperceptibly towards him. He felt like he had nowhere to go, that he was being slowly cornered. Michael noticed that the store was changing shape. The aisles began to stretch, the shelves seemed to grow, and products fell to the floor in patterns he couldn't understand. The lights flickered violently, and with each flash, he saw more figures appearing around him. The marks on the floor, which previously looked like tracks, now formed a perfect circle in the center of the store. Inside the circle, a black, viscous substance began to bubble, rising slowly, as if something was about to emerge. As Michael tried to escape, the glass on the main door began to become covered with words that appeared to be written by invisible hands. The letters came in rough script, dripping as if made of blood. "Make your choice, or everyone will pay the price." He tried to open the door again, but it was locked as before. Now the figures weren't just standing still. They moved, slowly walking towards him, like predators surrounding prey. The circle in the center of the store began to emit a pulsating red light, illuminating the entire space. From within the circle, a new figure emerged. It was larger, with an almost human shape, but disproportionate. His limbs were long and deformed, and his presence seemed to drain the air from the room. Michael felt his body weaken as he looked at the creature. His mind seemed to be invaded by a voice that wasn't his own. The door was opened. Now you are the secret keeper. The camera's monitor flashed again, displaying two choices. Destroy the portal. Accept the role. Michael looked at the circle of red light on the ground, which now seemed to be growing. He knew that if he chose to destroy the portal, there would be unpredictable consequences. But accepting whatever being the Guardian meant was equally terrifying. He picked up an iron bar he found on the counter and walked towards the circle. The surrounding figures seemed to hesitate, as if they were waiting for his decision. Michael raised the iron bar, ready to crush the center of the circle. The moment he did, the larger creature screamed, a guttural sound that seemed to tear apart reality itself. All the lights in the store exploded, plunging him into total darkness. When he reached the circle, a flash of white light enveloped everything, and he felt as if he was being sucked into an invisible vortex. Michael woke up lying on the floor of the store, surrounded by scattered products and knocked over shelves. The store was completely silent, and the figures had disappeared. The circle on the floor also no longer existed. He looked at the camera monitors. They were off, but a single message remained on the screen, flashing in red letters. The portal is closed, for now. As he tried to compose himself, he realized that the clock marked exactly the moment his shift had started. It was as if nothing had happened, except for the fact that he knew something very real and terrible had happened. He grabbed his things and left the store without looking back. Before we continue, if you like my content, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, at what time do you dare to listen to these macabre stories? Now, without further interruptions, let's move on to the next story. In the sleepy town of Springfield, Illinois, there was a 7-Eleven store on a deserted avenue, surrounded by abandoned fields and old trees that swayed in the wind. Despite its isolated location, the store was an essential stop for residents who needed something urgent during the early hours of the morning. Rachel, a 22-year-old university student, worked night shifts to supplement her income. She didn't believe in superstitions, but she heard rumors among her co-workers about the store. Some said that inexplicable things happened in the quietest of dawns, but Rachel ignored these stories, considering them attempts to scare her. That night, movement was practically non-existent. Rachel took advantage of the silence to clean the counter and organize the hallways. It was almost 2 a.m. when the doorbell rang for the first time. She looked at the entrance but saw no one. Rachel walked to the door, thinking the wind might have triggered it. Outside, the parking lot was empty. There were no cars, no people, just the dark road and the distant sound of the wind. Closing the door, she returned to the counter, but something was bothering her. The doorbell rang again. This time, Rachel was sure that something or someone was playing with her. With quick steps, he went to the entrance and looked outside, but found nothing but the early morning darkness. When he turned to go back to the counter, he noticed something strange. One of the hallways, which she had recently organized, was completely disorganized, with torn packets of snacks and soda cans scattered across the floor. Rachel went into the hallway to clean up the mess, but felt a chill when she saw that the products on the floor seemed to be arranged in a pattern. The packets of snacks formed crooked lines that led to the end of the hallway, where one of the lamps blinked dimly. She ignored the uncomfortable feeling, but as she collected the cans, she heard a low sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It stopped for a moment, but the sound stopped. Suddenly, the sound returned, louder and closer, coming from the warehouse at the back of the store. Rachel hesitated before opening the storage room door. Inside, the air was colder than normal, and the space seemed darker than normal, despite the lamps still being lit. She took a few steps inside, calling to see if anyone was there, but only received silence in response. When he reached the center of the warehouse, he found an open box on the floor. Inside was a small mirror with old, worn edges. As he bent down to pick up the mirror, something caught his attention. In the reflection, she saw a figure standing in the corner of the warehouse, completely still. Startled, Rachel quickly turned around, but there was no one there. When he looked in the mirror again, the figure was gone. Back in the main area of the store, Rachel went to the security camera monitor to check if anyone had entered. As she reviewed the images, she saw something that made her stomach turn. In the hallway, where she had cleaned up the mess, a shadow passed quickly, but it didn't look human. She fast-forwarded the video and saw something even more disturbing. In the warehouse, as she held the mirror, the figure in the reflection was visible on cameras, but never appeared on the recording directly. While watching the video, the lights in the store began to flicker. Rachel looked around, and the doorbell rang again, even though the door was completely closed. When Rachel returned to the counter, she noticed something was different. The aisles seemed longer, as if the store had expanded impossibly. Each aisle was lit by dim lights, and the shelves were filled with products she didn't recognize. She walked down the nearest hallway, trying to understand what was going on. When he reached the end, he found a large mirror hanging on the wall. When she looked at her reflection, she saw something that made her freeze. In the reflection, the hallway was full of shadowy figures standing between the shelves, looking straight at her. Rachel quickly turned around, but there was no one there. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed through the store like glass breaking. Rachel ran to check and found one of the drinks fridges with shattered glass. The soda bottle on the floor looked fresh, as if someone had just dropped it. In the reflection of the refrigerator, he saw the shadowy figure again. This time, she was closer, with a disproportionate body and long arms that seemed to reach all the way to the ground. When Rachel blinked, the figure disappeared again. But on the floor, black marks began to form, like footprints that led directly to the counter. Back at the counter, Rachel found something that hadn't been there before. A note written in hurried, shaky handwriting. The words said, "Don't look in mirrors." She felt the air around her grow colder and noticed that all the lights in the store had gone out, except for a single bulb at the back of the beverage aisle. On the camera monitor, a message flashed red. "They are here." Under the words, "They are here," they continued to flash on the monitor as Rachel felt panic take over her body. She tried to look away from the cameras, but she couldn't. Something seemed to draw her to the screen, as if it was impossible to stop watching. In the bottom corner of one of the recordings, Rachel saw a new figure. Unlike the previous shadows, this one was clearly human. He was a tall man, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that hid his face. He was standing in the far hallway, motionless, but his posture conveyed a sense of menace. As she watched, the figure slowly turned its head toward the camera, as if it knew it was being watched. Suddenly, the store's lights began to flicker frantically. Rachel tried to move away from the monitor, but the sound of something dragging across the floor made her freeze. She looked towards the drinks aisle and saw the man's figure now standing in the center of the aisle. He made no visible movement, but the sound continued, as if something invisible was approaching her. Rachel picked up her cell phone, but there was still no reception. The landline phone in the store also remained silent, and the idea of leaving through the front door seemed impossible. The parking lot was now shrouded in a thick fog that made it seem like the entire world had disappeared. Trying to find an explanation, Rachel returned to the hallway. As soon as he entered, he noticed that the mirrors were reflecting something that did not correspond to reality. In the reflection, she saw the store as if it was completely destroyed, with shelves toppled and products scattered. The man with the hat was there, but now he was moving slowly towards her, as if he were inside the reflection. Rachel stepped back, but when she turned to look directly down the hallway, it was empty. The mirrors started to crack. Small cracks appeared, spreading like cobwebs, as a sharp sound echoed throughout the store. Rachel ran toward the warehouse, believing the back door might be her only chance to escape. When he arrived, he found the door ajar, but something seemed wrong. The air was freezing, and the darkness beyond the door seemed thicker, almost as if it were solid. She heard footsteps coming from behind and quickly turned around. At the end of the corridor, the man's figure reappeared, now closer. His presence seemed to absorb all the light around him, making the environment increasingly gloomy. Rachel pushed the back door open hard, but found only a narrow hallway that she didn't recognize. It wasn't the path to the parking lot, but rather a space that seemed to stretch infinitely. With no alternative, Rachel entered the hallway. As she walked, she noticed him transforming. The walls began to look like the ones in the store, but the aisles were filled with old products, faded packaging, and labels she had never seen before. Each hallway seemed narrower than the last, and she began to hear whispers coming from all around her. The voices were indistinct, but they all seemed to say his name, repeating it slowly. When he reached the end of the corridor, he found a counter, identical to the one in the store. On the monitor, a single camera was active, showing herself, standing still and staring at the screen. A message appeared on the screen: "Go back and accept it." Rachel didn't know what that meant, but she felt like she needed to do something to get out of that place. She tried to touch the screen, but the monitor went out instantly, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway again. She turned and saw the man with the hat, now very close, his arms stretched out as if made of shadows. He had no face, just a darkness that seemed to move within where his eyes should have been. Before she could react, he raised one of his hands, pointing at her. Rachel felt like something was pulling her forward. Her vision became blurred, and she heard a loud buzzing sound, as if the air around her was vibrating. When she came to, she was back in the store, but something had changed. The lights were normal, and the store looked exactly as it had before. However, Rachel felt something was wrong. When he looked at the cameras, he saw that the reflections in the mirrors still showed the destroyed store, with the man in the hat standing in the center. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Rachel looked towards the entrance, but this time someone entered. It was an ordinary customer, a middle-aged man, who went straight to the refrigerator to get a drink. He didn't seem to notice anything wrong. Trying to act normal, Rachel returned to the counter. While serving the customer, he noticed something in his reflection in the glass of the refrigerator. It wasn't her anymore. Before we continue, if you liked my content, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, at what time do you dare to listen to these macabre stories? Now, without further interruptions, let's move on to the next story. In the heart of a deserted highway in Utah, there was a 7-Eleven store that was frequently visited by truck drivers, lonely travelers, and residents of remote areas. Isolated from any major city, the store was an essential stopping point, but also a place surrounded by rumors of strange happenings. Tom, a 35-year-old war veteran, had started working the early morning shift as a way to deal with the emptiness of his new routine. The silence of the store gave him a feeling of control, and he enjoyed the simple work of organizing shelves and serving the few customers who showed up. That night, everything seemed normal. The store was empty, and the only soundtrack was the faint hum of the beverage cooler. At around 2:30 in the morning, the landline rang. Tom found the sound strange, as the phone was rarely used, but he went to answer it. Before he could speak, he heard a hoarse, almost whispering voice on the other side. "You are alone now. They are coming." Before he could respond, the line went dead. Tom stared at his phone, trying to understand what had just happened. He checked the screen, but the caller's number was not registered. A chill ran down his spine. He looked around the store, but everything seemed normal. Trying to calm down, he went back to the counter and checked the security cameras. All the screens showed empty hallways except one. The camera pointing toward the parking lot captured something unusual: an old car parked next to a gas station. The vehicle was off, but it appeared that there was someone in the driver's seat, motionless. Tom looked at the store entrance, but no one had entered. He then checked the camera again, but this time the car was gone. As he tried to rationalize what he had seen, the store's lights flickered for a moment before stabilizing again. The doorbell rang, but when Tom looked at the entrance, it was closed. Suddenly, he heard a noise coming from the snack aisle. It was the sound of something being knocked over. He slowly walked there and found packets of potato chips scattered on the floor. He bent down to pick them up, but stopped when he saw something engraved on the shelf. "You are not alone." Tom's heart skipped a beat. He looked around, trying to find a logical explanation, but the silence in the store was overwhelming. He went back to the counter, grabbed his cell phone, and tried to call the police, but the signal was completely dead. Tom went back to the security cameras and noticed that all the screens were jammed except for one, the one showing the store's central aisle. There he saw something that made him freeze. A tall, hooded figure stood between the shelves, motionless. Tom looked straight into the hallway, but there was no one there. When he looked back at the camera, the figure had disappeared. The landline phone rang again, interrupting his thoughts. He answered, breathing heavily, but before he could speak, the same hoarse voice said, "You see it now. They're already in." As soon as he hung up the phone, the lights in the store began to flicker violently, and the air around him became colder. Tom heard a metallic sound coming from the warehouse door in the back. He grabbed a flashlight and a wrench from under the counter, trying to prepare himself for whatever might come. When he opened the warehouse door, he found the space completely empty, except for a single chair in the center. Strapped to it was a store mannequin with a human face mask that looked like it was handmade. On the mask, someone had written, "Choose quickly." The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, but Tom couldn't see anyone. He ran back into the main area of the store, locking the door behind him. Back at the counter, Tom saw that the cameras now showed hooded figures entering the hallways one by one. They moved slowly, but their shapes were erratic, as if they were made of liquid shadows. The doorbell rang again, but this time Tom didn't look at the entrance. He knew something was there, and he didn't want to see it. A new message appeared on the security monitor. "You have 10 minutes. Suddenly, the landline phone rang again. Tom answered hesitantly, and the hoarse voice said, "Give up or fight. There is no other way." Below the counter, he found a box that wasn't there before. Inside was an old radio, with a button that looked like an emergency lever. Next to the radio, a note said, "Activate to close doors, but someone must stay behind." Tom felt a knot in his stomach. He knew the figures were approaching. Time was running out, and he needed to decide. The hooded figures began to surround him, moving slowly but accurately. The store seemed to be shrinking, with the walls closing in around it. He looked at the radio, holding the lever, but hesitated. The camera monitor now only showed a message in red letters. "Who will you save?" He pulled the lever. As soon as Tom pulled the lever, the shrill sound of an alarm echoed through the store. The lights flickered violently, plunging everything into a chaotic dance of shadows and blinding flashes. The hooded figures, which had previously moved slowly, stopped for a brief moment, as if reacting to the device's activation. The radio in the box started making a strange noise, like static mixed with distant screams. Tom stepped back, feeling the weight of the air around him increase, as if something invisible was pressing against his chest. Suddenly, the store's front door locked automatically with a loud click. The hooded figures, now prevented from leaving, began to contort in unnatural ways, their bodies distorting into shapes that defied logic. As he tried to understand what was happening, Tom noticed that the floor of the store was starting to shift. A perfect circle of symbols appeared in the center, etched directly into the ground. The symbols glowed a deep red, pulsing like a beating heart. In the middle of the circle, a crack began to open, revealing a darkness even more intense than that surrounding the figures. It was like looking into an infinite abyss, and from within it came the sounds of something large and hungry. A new message appeared on the cameras. "Someone must come in. Close the portal, or it will open forever." The landline rang again, but this time Tom knew he had to answer it. With a shaking hand, he picked up the device. The hoarse voice spoke, but it sounded different now, closer and colder. "Your choice has been made. You have activated the portal. Now you must decide who will seal it." Tom tried to shout in protest, but the line went dead before he could respond. He looked at the hooded figures, who were now positioned around the circle, all looking directly at him. The radio on the counter began to blink, emitting a rising sound that seemed synchronized with the glow of the symbols on the floor. Tom knew he didn't have much time. He felt his heart race as he tried to find a solution. He could enter the portal to close it from the inside or try to use the radio to force the figures through. But something inside him told him the portal required a conscious sacrifice. The surrounding sound grew louder and the ground began to shake. Tom looked back at the portal and saw something moving inside, something that seemed to be waiting. Tom took a deep breath, his mind quickly going through all the possible options. He knew that if he entered the portal, he would probably never come back. But if he did nothing, whatever was inside the abyss would be released, and the consequences would be unimaginable. With steady steps, he walked towards the circle. The hooded figures didn't move, but he felt their blank stares following him. As soon as he entered the circle, the sound around him abruptly ceased. The portal stood before him, pulsing and inviting. He reached out his hand hesitantly, touching the void, which instantly pulled him in. The moment Tom disappeared into the abyss, the lights in the store returned to normal, and the circle on the floor disappeared. The hooded figures began to fade into shadows, evaporating one by one until the store was completely empty. Outside, the parking lot was calm, and the fog that had enveloped the store lifted, revealing the road and the clear early morning horizon. When the manager arrived for the morning shift, he found the store in perfect condition. Nothing seemed out of place, except for Tom's disappearance. There were no signs of a struggle or anything out of the ordinary. The only clue left was the radio on the counter, still blinking faintly, as if it was waiting for someone to turn it back on.